Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, sitting down again to talk with all of you about Starfield, where we have a massive update here on the game story, and one that we've been looking for a long while. What I'm talking about is context to the things that we've been hearing so much about. You see, with Starfield, it feels like we've been walking around in a dark room for a while, trying to find our way, and now we have a little bit of context. What's great about all of this information is that it feels very spoiler-free. I don't feel like anything for the story has been ruined for me. I just get a better idea of the characters who I'm going to be interacting with. Now, if you want to go in 110% blind, completely knowing nothing, maybe tab off this video. I do have one update for you beyond any story stuff that we'll get into first and foremost. You can click off as soon as you like. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, if you are new here and you're into Starfield news, information, conversation, discussions, previews, reviews maybe, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. And before we get our brains in motion, let's talk a bit about learning, shall we? A word from today's sponsor. The following video is brought to you by Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. We have a little bit of a joke on my game development team that we're Google Sheets the game. And the idea is that we use spreadsheets for everything from visualizing ideas to actually putting data into the engine for our game. So one thing that I was actually using Brilliant for recently was to learn more about visualizing data. And that's why I personally like to use Brilliant. They just have an answer for anything on math, data science, computer science that I want to learn. And whatever your skill level is, Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs and lets you solve at your own pace. This is good for someone like me. I'm more of a writer. I don't have a great math brain, but in a small team, everyone needs to wear multiple hats. So you got to enhance your skills where you can. So does this sound great to you? It should. Why don't you go ahead to brilliant.org/MrMattyPlays. The first 200 people get 20% off an annual plan by visiting this URL, and you can get started for free for 30 days. So, hot topic around the gaming community and reviewers alike has been Starfield review codes. When are they going out? Naturally, with a game as large as Starfield, reviewers are going to need a lot of time. And according to Tom Henderson, they're going out later this week. Now, why this is important to all of you beyond people like myself, I don't know if I'm going to get a code, but people like myself who like to review games having enough time to develop an opinion, it also is a good way following Redfall with Bethesda's actions there to gauge confidence in the title. Getting a lot of time here with the game is a pretty good sign of things naturally. But also what this communicates to people is, when do you go into hiding? Because naturally when review codes go out, there are a ton of people who are extremely irresponsible with it and ruin the game for folks like me and others who just want to cover the game. And so when that type of leak happens after review codes go out, especially for smaller creators who maybe get them a little bit later, the pipeline constricts a bit and they start to get cut off because the developers, the publishers just don't want to take any chances ruining what has been years and years and years of hard work. But with the game as anticipated as Starfield, make no mistake, this one's going to have a couple of things slip through the cracks. So now is a good time to clear your watch history on YouTube, mute some words over on Twitter, and really start avoiding things if you are trying to stay completely spoiler free, because with the reviews coming, naturally people are going to try to leak stuff for their 15 minutes of fame, which is frustrating. I agree, but it's just something you need to be privy to. So that's the status over on review codes. Crossing my fingers I get something here. When Fallout 4 came around, I got it the weekend before, if my review wasn't anything to go by for that one. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk Starfield's story a bit, shall we? We've heard a lot of terms spit out. United Colonies, Free Star Collective, the Colony Wars. What's the context to all of this? Well, now with a new timeline posted over on Bethesda.net, we have a much better idea of that. Now, alongside this, and I imagine I'm not speaking too soon by saying this, I think some new trailers and conversations, like into the Starfield style conversations, are going to arrive, because I saw someone on Twitter, don't have their posted a clip of a trailer no one saw with new screenshots, new gameplay, very brief, just quick snapshots of things, but it was new comments from Will Shen, and it's gone. I can't find anyone talking about it, anyone reposting it, anyone asking where it went. I feel like I'm in a different dimension, but I saw it, so I imagine we're going to get more content in the coming weeks. So fret not, people. Starfield marketing is on the way. Let's begin at the top of the timeline. Now, keep in mind, Starfield begins at 2330 AD. Meanwhile, this timeline is 2050. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of time has passed as our adventure begins in Starfield. So in 2050, we learned that humans first arrive on Mars, and by 2100, humans are living in space. In 2156, humans arrive in Alpha Centauri, which is 4.37 light years away from Earth. And in 2159, the United Colonies are established. By 2160, just a single year later, New Atlantis is founded, which is the biggest city that Bethesda has apparently ever built, and becomes the official capital city of the United Colonies in 2161, so another year later. By 2167, Cheyenne is settled by Solomon Coe, who founds its first settlement, Akila City. Coe invites Volley to join Cheyenne in a new alliance, the Freestar Collective. The Freestar Collective is officially formed in 2189. So first and foremost, this is where Starfield tries to find some of its realism, kind of predicting humanity is going to be on Mars by 2050. We could be lining Todd Howard up for a little Kojima-ass moment here, if that ends up being accurate. However, what I really wanted to pay attention to here was Solomon Coe. Sounds like maybe the grandfather of Sam Coe, who was one of the companions in the game that we meet. We'll actually have more context on him here, but now you can see a bit of the bloodline is here. But what's also interesting is that Coe invites Volley to join Cheyenne in a new alliance. What's Volley, you may be asking? Well, it's one of the various star systems you're going to find in Starfield, and in particular, what's worth noting here is that one of the most anticipated planets for fans to explore, Neon, is located within this system. So I think some visual context there helps. This is how the Freestar Collective was formed. This is how the United Colonies were formed. And Freestar, you may note, came after the fact. And so that's important to distinguish here because yeah, they're going to butt heads soon. By 2194, the United Colonies positions the star station called the Clinic in orbit around Dipala in the Narian system. The unaffiliated peoples of the Narian system see this as the United Colonies' attempt to expand their borders and demand the United Colony remove the Clinic. When the United Colony refuses, the people of Narian vote to join the Freestar Collective, who mobilize to protect the system in 2195. Then, another year later, in response to Freestar mobilization, the United Colonies moves a fleet into the Narian system, and Freestar responds in kind. The Narian War begins. The Narian War drags on as public sentiment sours. Finally, the Treaty of Narian is signed by United Colony and Freestar Collective in 2216, ending the conflict. The term settled systems is formalized in the treaty. Then, the Freestar Rangers, 5 years later, are founded as an elite protective and investigative force dedicated to serving all citizens of the Freestar Collective. Now, according to GameMaps.com, the Narian system is a level 1 star system in the Starfield galaxy with 7 planets and 8 moons, which I think is just worth taking note of that it's level 1 because we know that we can augment how far we can jump to different planets and different systems in Starfield, so this should be an early encounter for most players. One thing that you probably want to have cleared up for yourself here is when you go back to that animated trailer we saw of what was a war ongoing, within, it looked like the Freestar Collective system, looked like it may have been Oculus City. What's going on there? Is that the same war? That was the Colony War, which actually has yet to happen. So this is kind of new for us to learn that there was a second war that occurred before the only war we knew about. But this is how the settled systems came to be. So important context here that there is a bloody history between these two factions involving already 2 wars. And I could see maybe us getting involved in a third during the course of Starfield. Now let's get into where our player factors in more so. Constellation. Constellation is formed by Sebastian Banks in 2275. Original members include Chloe Bao, accomplished physicist, Aja Mamasa, the youngest member and Sebastian's protege, Darius Andrus, botanist and specialist in xenoflora, Bernadette Laurent, wealthy heiress and adventurer, Everardo Gill, former smuggler, and Kadri Toma, biologist and physician. The lodge is built in New Atlantis to serve the needs and people of Constellation for generations to come. Now, there's a pretty big gap here, as in 2305, Barrett joins Constellation. Then 2 years later, the Freestar Collective begins farming on the planet of Vesta and the Lunara system. By 2308, so a year later, the United Colonies claim that by establishing a colony in a 4th star system, the Freestar Collective has violated the Treaty of Narian. Diplomatic talks break down, and the UC lays siege to Vesta, killing anyone who stayed behind or was brought in to defend it. The colony wars officially begin. Meanwhile, Constellation is off doing their own thing. 3 years later, in 2310, Constellation comes into possession of their first artifact and tucks it away in the Constellation archives. So a lot to take away from here. Number one, we now have a name for the location of where Constellation hangs out in New Atlantis, which we've seen multiple times, both inside and even entering the place where you put your watch up and it opens up the doors. It's called the Lodge. Not only that, but the members and their history is important to note because you see they come from all different walks of life, which is much the case with the more current members on the team, which we'll get into here as well. So it seems like all these people come together from different paths to unite to research these artifacts. What I'm curious about is when it's randomly formed here in the timeline, what was the cause for this? Because it's not until over 30 years later almost that they find an artifact. So what made them want to start searching for this stuff in the first place? That could be a piece of the story, because you note that there's a pretty massive gap in that first forming a constellation and when Barrett joins. So something happened that brought that man in. And Barrett, for those who don't know, is one of the game's main companions that you see early on in some of the Starfield footage. So this is where he gets involved with things. And by the time the game starts, remember I said 2330, he'll be a long-standing member of Constellation. And he was very surprised to see you and what happened with your interactions with the artifacts, which Constellation at least already has one of those by the time you get involved with things. So maybe it's once you find that piece, as we've seen in the Starfield Direct, it seems very much heavily indicated that we're going to find a piece of the artifacts ourselves and bring it to Constellation. They may be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and that's where the broader mystery should truly begin. So in 2311, after several years of conflict, the colony war effectively comes to an end with the Battle of Cheyenne, as a flotilla of civilian and military Freestar Collective ships takes down the major ships of the United Colonies Navy using hit-and-run tactics. Then, 4 years later, the United Colonies Vanguard is founded as part of the United Colony response to the Freestar Collective's use of civilian ships during the Colony War. The Vanguard is the United Colony's own civilian navy, relying on civilians using their own ships, who pledge to protect the United Colonies and its interests. The ultimate reward for this service is citizenship in the United Colonies. More on that in a little. Then, 4 years later, Sarah Morgan, one of the game's other companions, becomes the youngest head of the United Colonies Navigator Corps, though its short-lived position as the division is shut down a single year later in 2320. Cast adrift, but still eager to put her training to good use, Morgan joins Constellation. And then 2 years later, Walter Stroud, co-owner of Stroud Eklund, one of the Settled System's premier starship manufacturers, joins Constellation and becomes its primary financial backer. So the Battle of Cheyenne is likely what we saw in that Starfield animated trailer, where we saw, unfortunately, a character's parents passing away. That, to me, strikes me as where that battle took place, because we know Cheyenne is Freestar Collective territory. It was a very deserty region, and we saw that this was a bit of backstory to Oculus City. So I feel like that's what we were seeing there, was the Battle of Cheyenne. Meanwhile, we learn a bit about the Vanguard and how they were formed, which was in response to the Freestar Collective and the Freestar Rangers. Now, what's interesting about this is the ultimate reward to this service and joining up is citizenship with the United Colonies. Why this is important is, again, we go back to that animated trailer and we see a courier show up on the planet and he's all wowed by New Atlantis. Wow, this is what humanity is capable of. And what's the first thing he does? He signs up for the Vanguard, goes out, collects a ton of money, and then starts living his life, but then eventually goes back out on adventure. So what this kind of establishes to me is, maybe, I'm just guessing here, a little indication is we're going to be this new character arriving at New Atlantis for the first time, right? And maybe to even explore New Atlantis, you have to get your citizenship with the United Colonies. I wonder if there's multiple ways to do that before you even make it to Constellation. So that's where my head goes a bit. Meanwhile, we know that at least Sarah Morgan has been a part of Constellation for a decade by the time that we have started our game, and Walter Stroud is going to be there for 9 years. Continuing on, though, we get a little more context on other members of Constellation currently part of the team, like former Crimson Fleet pirate Vladimir Saul joining Constellation in 23-22, and Sarah Morgan becoming acting chair of Constellation, so pretty much the head, it sounds like, in 23-25, and then theologian Matteo Catri joins Constellation. Then in 23-26, Barrett finds the original artifact in the Constellation archives and knows it must be special. That same year, after months of correspondence with Sarah Morgan, graduate student and gifted scientist Noel is invited to join Constellation. A year later, Freestar Ranger Sam Coe and his daughter Cora join Constellation. And in 23-28, Andrea joins Constellation. Then, that same year, Barrett convinces Constellation to purchase Star Station L868 and modify it to become a deep space scanner nicknamed the Eye. So we actually have a lot of visual context for everything here because it's more caught up with stuff that we're seeing in game. We see Vladimir. We see Sarah, of course. We know what Matteo looks like. We also know about Noel. It's interesting that they've been in correspondence for a couple months and then was eventually invited. Knowing that Sam Coe is a part of Constellation, that it reaches even out to the Freestar Collective, is actually pretty interesting. And knowing his daughter Cora is involved is also cool. Now, Andrea, we don't have any visual context for. What we do have context for, though, is the Eye. This is something that we've seen in a couple of trailers, both internally and externally. And if you really want to throw it back to Starfield's initial reveal trailer, the first time we ever saw Starfield, we saw the Eye. Everyone thought it was like a satellite station, and it kind of is. And what it's used is to spot various things in the galaxy. I love the name for it as the Eye. But nonetheless, that was something that Barrett had played a major factor in. So you see Barrett coming up a lot here. What I found most weird in this part of the timeline is the very specific mentioning of Barrett finds the original artifact in the Constellation archives and knows it must be special. So was there this era of Constellation that we read about earlier in the timeline, and maybe they dissolved or they were located somewhere else with this artifact, and Barrett, as part of Constellation, almost 20 years later now, finds this artifact and almost reignites their efforts, and then you come in 4 years later and you say, hey, look what I found. So we're starting to put some of the pieces together, but you know what I love about this is what I've been saying the whole time with Starfield story. We still know so little. We still know so little about it in the scheme of things. Like, yeah, we have context for why people are doing certain things, and that's really all you can ask for, because now, after this point in the timeline I showed you, it says 2330. So 2 years have passed since the final action on the timeline, Starfield begins. And that's it. Boom. So yeah, man, there's a lot going on here, and it's really exciting stuff because I still feel like I'm like, okay, what are we trying to find this for? What was Constellation formed for? What do they think is out there? That mystery is so intriguing, and I'm still so impressed that Bethesda's kept it well guarded, which is why I warned you all about the review codes up front, because I really hope this stuff does not leak, because right now, I love, if it delivers, that is, I love how secretive they've been with this story, and especially because we don't know much about like other factions and whatnot. We've just seen glimpses of things. So this little bit of context, I still feel like I know so little. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's everything I got for you in today's Starfield video. Pretty jam-packed one, going over some of these news, story details, and review code information. So with that, if you are new here, consider subscribing once more, and I look forward to hearing from all of you down below. What do you think of this timeline information? Be sure to fire away. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the heck out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.